All right, good morning, everyone. Can you hear me? Great. Well, first of all, thanks for having me. Thanks for making time to meet together and chat. And it's a great pleasure to be here, not only because it's my first time in Italy and in this area, but also because I've interacted with a number of you online but we've never met at a physical place. Like I remember having interaction with Helen, 4 years ago, but never been in the same place, in Ismail too. So it's great to be here. I'll start our day today by talking about network scholarship, and how I'm going to proceed is by first bringing up some potentials around this topic, exploring some challenges, and then raising a couple of issues or a couple of provocations, I guess, that came up in our research that I thought were really interesting. So 2 by 2 by 2, and then I'll turn it over to the rest of the people here. I spend most of my time doing research and trying to make sense of academics' experiences in online networks and online spaces, and that's what I'm going to draw from today. So just to get started, when I talk about network scholarship, this is essentially what I'm talking about. Scholars' use of participatory technologies and online social networks to share, reflect upon, critique, improve, validate, and further their scholarship. So 2 of those words are really significant there, the idea of scholars and scholarship. Scholars in my world refers to academics, which also includes PhD students. So I think that's important to recognize. So not only faculty members, but also PhD students that are working, creating, making sense and disseminating knowledge. And scholarship, again, in my world, refers to both research and teaching activities, right? So kind of a broad perspective on that. And just to give you a couple of examples of what I'm thinking of when I think of network scholarship, this might be, for example, a cultural anthropologist that creates and shares their syllabus online, right? They post it on their blog. It might be a geographer that has draft versions of their research paper on their website. It might be a political scientist that uses Twitter data to predict elections. And maybe if that person did a really good job, they could have predicted Trump's victory. Maybe not. Who knows? But those are kind of the things that I'm, thinking about, right? Participating on blogs, on Twitter, having debates, connecting with diverse audiences. Surveys in the US show that over time there's increasing adoption of social media by academics. Most of the adoption is on a personal rather than professional level, but the personal and the professional overlap, and we'll get to that in a little bit. But adoption also varies by tool. Some surveys show adoption varying between 40 and 70% depending on the tool, and other surveys show adoption ranging from 15 to 40%. So if you put all of that together, well, adoption varies between 15 and 70%. On the lower end, it might be Twitter. On the higher end of the spectrum, it might be things like YouTube, right? So YouTube has a social networking component on it or a social media component on it, but because it aligns well with the types of things that we're used to do in higher education, like showing up a video and having conversations with students, then it's easier to adopt than something that might question our traditional practices, right? Which Twitter might tend to do because it's this place where everything kind of collapses. So talking about potentials next, emergent forms of scholarship are seen as potentially disruptive and transformative. They're seen as major breakthroughs in rethinking the ways that we do scholarship, that we engage with one another. And we frequently hear that the idea is to enhance the impact and reach of our scholarship. When conversations center around impact, we we tend to think of impact on stakeholders, and those stakeholders might be students, they might be in my discipline, they might be helping teachers rethink their teaching practices, right? Teachers who might not necessarily be reading the journals in which we publish our research. We might be reaching out to them, and we might be engaging with them by being online. And by reach, again, we're thinking about similar audiences and reaching to them through a more democratic and an accessible space. The second potential in seeing academics participate on social media is this idea of fostering a more democratic, equitable, efficient, transparent, scholarly process. And in thinking about scholarship as research and teaching, we explore the idea that by being at a place where individuals can flow in and out without much barriers, right? So if you imagine Twitter to be a place where anyone can sign up, as compared to a learning management system where it controls access based on registration to an institution, there's a potential there to bring a large variety of individuals together to negotiate a shared understanding of a topic, right? So I can connect with teachers in France, I can connect with students in Italy, and those individuals might not necessarily be registered at my institution, but we can still share and exchange our views on a particular topic. So that summary is generally the idea that's presented to advance the hope that social media or online networks might provide potential to rethink how we do higher education. Now, just moving on to a couple of tensions and conundrums that rise when we think about this. It's often in the literature. It's often, or I guess the literature is often presented in kind of a hopeful, positive note, right? And that's a critique of the educational technology literature in general. There's a number of academics have described it as this endless, hopeful, positive expectation that tools will impact our practice in a positive way. But when we examine this practice on the ground, we see a number of tensions come up. The first one that we've encountered quickly in our research was this idea of navigating personal and professional relationships online. In interviewing academics, a number have told us that they have difficulty figuring out what to share on their accounts on Facebook or on Twitter that would be seen as appropriate for different audiences that they connect with, right? And if you think of Facebook back in 2012, let's say 2011, right? Around the time when we're starting to engage with this tool, we had, I guess, a not as clear understanding of its implications as a socio-political tool. And at the time, when we did our research around that time, a lot of the people that we interviewed had told us that they were essentially connecting with a wide array of individuals. And in connecting with a wide array of individuals, they created kind of a conundrum that they had to live in. And that conundrum was that they allowed this large group of people in their network, and that large network of people had different expectations around the ways that individuals would be participating. So I remember two instances when talking with colleagues that said, well, I've accepted my high school friends I haven't talked to for a number of years, my colleagues at my current institution, and then my students. And at some point I said something that had to do with religion, And then all these people were fighting on my wall around religion. And what then I ended up becoming was a referee of different perspectives. And I was really concerned on how my high school friends' perspectives that I had interacted with for so many years would be viewed by my colleagues that I'm interacting with every day on campus. Even though these individuals were not sharing the perspectives of their friends, but they were concerned about how those perspectives would reflect on them. So not only were they concerned about their own participation, but they were concerned about how others' participation will reflect upon them. And how do people respond to that? A number of people that we've talked to have thrown their hands up and said, well, this is how it is, and it's really difficult for me to manage it. Others have sought to curtail their friends and create spaces that would reflect who they are currently. A number of individuals we've talked to have created multiple accounts recently, and that you can put me in that space. People have started withdrawing for different reasons. But this is a real concern in my perspective. The second challenge that I think comes up is this idea of systemic issues. And there's a number of examples here, but I'm going to just mention two. The first one is that academics work in an environment that lacks established frameworks to evaluate the legitimacy and quality of our digital participation. Right? A colleague recently sent a tweet to Bonnie and I saying, I'm applying for full professorship. Do you have a sense of how I can use my digital activities to relate to my colleagues the impact I'm having online, right? And I usually get that question because host institutions don't have an evaluation framework to say, this is how we're going to evaluate your online participation. Not that they should, but they don't necessarily have one. Whereas it's easy to say, well, you have two publications in peer-reviewed Tier 1 journals, which are, Educational Researcher or the Oxford Review of Higher Education or whatever. Therefore, you get, X points, even though you don't get points, but that's essentially how it's set up, right? Or with the new exercise in the UK, they're at that rank and so on. But we don't have that for our Twitter accounts. I think one question to bring up is should we have metrics for our digital participation, and should we use that to evaluate promotion or tenure and so on? The second systemic issue that comes up is what institutions consider appropriate practice. And this issue has come up very well recently in the last couple of years with a number of academics getting in trouble for what they've done online. There's a research paper published last year that evaluated Canadian institutions' policies around what is appropriate digital practice for academics. And by digital practice, they're looking at social media. And what that research found is that the policies were centered around surveillance and around making sure that academics did not say anything that would negatively impact the brand and the institution was setting up for them, right? It was less about encouraging diverse participation with a broad audience, but more about making sure that the institution was not positioned in a negative light. And I think that's significant to consider when we hear narratives around, using social media to have debates and explore alternative ideas around teaching and research and so on. Moving on to a couple of provocations that came up in our work that I thought would be interesting to bring up. Was first this idea of follower counts and alternative metrics. So I'm thinking about how institutions might evaluate our participation online in making decisions around our work.
So you will get 5 minutes to plug it.
Great. We've seen alternative metrics. We've seen discussions around alternative metrics. I guess referring to how we can use different ideas to evaluate our work, right? Standard metrics might be things like citation rates or impact factors and so on. And follower counts, or Twitter follower count, is one of those things that has come up in evaluating how productive we might be online, or how we might evaluate how much reach we have, right? In the same way that we might look at someone's downloads on SlideShare or blog views and so on. So one question that we wanted to ask was, well, what do follower counts really mean, right? Does someone who have a large number of follower counts mean that they reach more people online? Does it mean that they have a greater impact and so on? So we gathered data from around 470 education researchers, and then run a regression to see, well, what might predict follower counts, right? And this is essentially what we found, and I'll explain this to you because I think it's important. The first number of interest would be that R-square number. So we found that we can explain 83% of the variation in follower counts. And we can do that by looking at 4 variables. Those 4 variables are the log of the number of people that one follows. So the more people that you follow, the greater number of followers you'll have. The second is the number of tweets. The more you post, the greater number of followers you have. The third is the role that you have on your bio. And under role, we essentially looked at students and professors, and we found that those individuals who signal themselves as professors have greater number of followers than those that signal themselves as students. And the last one is lifespan. How long have you been on Twitter? So we can see that participation essentially predicts follower counts, right? And the greater participation, the greater time you're on there, the greater number of followers that you have. So we see nothing on here around scholarship. We see nothing on here around scholarly products, and we get significant practical advice, I guess, for those individuals that would like to game the system and bring and show greater number of followers if their institutions value that kind of practice, right? So follow more people. So and I think this is where questions come up around, well, do policies that look at our social media participation without a deep understanding of what that means make sense, right? Or are we creating systems that are similar to our current systems that have problems? So systems that have problems right now might be just blindly looking at the number of citations that a researcher has without looking behind that number, right? Because a citation does not necessarily mean that your work is impactful, right? It might be that people are citing your paper because it's a really bad example of how not to do research. So I guess similar here. The last provocation I'm going to bring up is this idea of the audiences that we have online and what audiences we imagine. We just finished this research and submitted it to a journal in the field, but we looked at what audiences academics imagine when they are online, and in interviewing them, we found that the audiences that they imagine are colleagues, students, current students, past students, people in the field that relate to their research, so in our case, teachers, educational practitioners, and so on. So we understood those to be the audiences that academics imagine when they're online. So when they're participating, their participation is shaped by their understanding of those audiences. But when we look at the audiences that institutions imagine that their scholars are interacting with, we see a different kind of audience. We see narratives around participating to meet journalists, to meet funding agencies, to meet other peers that will cite your work, right? So we think that that misalignment has significant implications for how institutions create policies and think about the work that their employees are engaging with online. And that might be one of the reasons why there's tensions between academics on the one hand and the ways that they like to participate online or that they imagine participating online, and institutions on the other hand where they might be trying to preserve the brand or the idea that they created about themselves. So I'll stop there. The research that I described is on my website. Those are just the citations, and I'll post this presentation on SlideShare at the end of the day. Thanks so much.
Thanks, George, for sharing with us all the work you did these 6 past years at your share. You are opening the session and even the whole day.